With the opening of pre-orders, Phantom Blade Zero has also released the PC system requirements and an 11-minute gameplay trailer. Now, this game is developed in Unreal Engine 5. However, I did find this statement from the developers where they seem very cognizant of how expensive hardware is right now and that players are concerned about not wanting to upgrade their system to play new games. With this article saying that the developers won't lock players out of Phantom Blade Zero as dev vows low-end hardware and Steam Deck optimization, where they specifically acknowledge, this quote from the developers, "This year the hardware price is going up and people who want to replace their hardware may postpone their plan to upgrade their equipment. So we think we need to let the game be played by as many players as possible without reducing the quality." They also talked about trying to have Steam Deck support, if possible, all of that. So the developers do seem at least aware of the situation and are promising work on optimization, but promises and what actually happens, we do have to see how this goes. Now, some people I think thought this was more of a Souls-like game. It seems to be a little more action-heavy. This 11-minute gameplay trailer does say it was captured on the PlayStation 5, so you can get a look at kind of what the PS5 version of the game looks like, and it does seem to be running at 60 FPS, albeit looks like a good amount of upscaling happening. You can see some things on the ground popping in and out of view, so there's obviously some turning down of how far they could have pushed things, I think, for optimization purposes, but I think that's what a lot of people are wanting. Now, with all of that in mind, they have also promised that this game will feature ray tracing, which we knew from the start. So, because 7 months ago, we actually got this little NVIDIA features RTX on, RTX off, where you can see that they talk about ray traced reflections in the water and things like that. But interestingly, on the developer's actual website, in addition to a ray tracing recommended specification, they've also posted a path tracing recommended specification. So I hadn't heard the game would feature path tracing, but they're releasing a path tracing recommended spec, so that seems to be the case, that they will be supporting that. Now, I had to go to the developer's website to find that information. If you just check on their Steam page, they just have a minimum and recommended spec, which thankfully is a lot lower than what they're showing for the ray tracing and path tracing. And the specs for minimum and recommended on their website do match what we're seeing on Steam. And this game does have an October 28th release date. So let's go ahead and dive into what these system requirements are telling us. So the developers are saying that they're, thinking about people on lower end hardware being able to play the game, and they're promising that if you have a GTX 1660 6GB or an AMD RX 5500 XT 8GB version, I believe there were also 4GB versions of that card, that you will be able to play the game. However, they're noting it's for 1080p output resolution with upscaling enabled. They're not noting what level of upscaling, and that's just to hit 30 FPS. So you can play the game on pretty modest hardware, but again, they're targeting 30 FPS with upscaling to get there on just a 1080p output. Now, their recommended spec, I do like that they're targeting 1440p here for recommended, because I think a lot of PC gamers have moved to a 1440p display, although 1080p is still quite popular. And they're targeting 60 FPS, and this being the kind of game I'd probably play on a controller, 60 FPS seems pretty good target for me. But again, that is with upscaling enabled. Here they're targeting an RTX 3060 Ti 8GB or RX 6700 XT 12GB card, so indicating that an 8GB card should be able to play the game. And from a system RAM standpoint, which didn't used to be that big of a deal, but with prices now being what they are, it's become a bigger deal. They're looking at 16GB of system memory should be okay even for the recommended spec. And the CPU side of things, on the minimum, AMD Ryzen 5 3600 or Core i7 8700K, and recommended jumping to an i5 10600K or Ryzen 5 5600X. Now, if you're not sure what that means, the Ryzen 5 3600 was a mid-range 6-core 12-thread CPU from 2019. So we're talking 7 years ago, and it launched at about $200. Now, that's the minimum spec CPU. The recommended CPU moving to Ryzen 5 5600X, which is one generation newer, still 6-core 12-thread, but did get a noticeable bump in gaming performance generationally there. That was a 2020 CPU and coming in at $299. So there was a price bump, although you could get these for a little over $100 for quite a while there. So the price did, of course, come down over time. Now, relative to like gaming consoles, the Ryzen 5 3600 is fairly comparable to the gaming performance you get out of the like PlayStation 5 CPU, although it's not an exact hardware match. The actual gaming performance tends to be pretty close, although in some games the console optimizations seem to hold up a little bit better on the CPU side than what we see on PC. The 5600X has a bit more raw gaming power than the PlayStation 5 would. But like I said, sometimes the console optimization eats into that advantage a little bit. So that's what you're looking at on the CPU side of things. Now, if you're looking at the recommended GPUs, you're like, okay, neat, that's not what I have, so I have no idea where I stand. Let's take a look at that. So I recommend, and I'll link in the video description, the Tech Power Up Relative Performance Chart as not something that tells you exactly how you'll perform in that specific game or how GPUs would line up to each other in this specific game, but more of you can click on like the minimum GPU and then get an idea of where your GPU is relative to that. So for example, they're recommending the GTX 1660, and if we click on that, that's a 100% baseline. Now you can tell that if you have an RTX 3050 8GB version, that you're at 102% of the performance, or in other words, 2% faster on average, or in other words, about the same. So if you have a 3050, you would also expect to be at about 1080p 30 FPS with upscaling, although being on the 30 series means you could use DLSS upscaling, whereas the 1660 would probably be using either FSR or using Unreal Engine's TSR for the upscaling in that case. The 5500 XT from AMD is also listed here, and interestingly, that's generally a bit slower than a 1660, although here they have it reaching 88% of the performance, so it's still in a pretty similar performance ballpark. So in other words, if the 5500 XT is averaging about 30 FPS, according to their minimum spec, then maybe the 1660 is actually closer to like, 35 FPS or 40. And in general, it's important to read these system requirements charts as not really saying you'll average 30 in a benchmark chart. It's more like a typical experience will be in like the 30 to 40 FPS range here. And, maybe even there's some dips into the 20s in the more demanding scenes. Same way, the 60 FPS target also shouldn't be read as like an exact benchmark average. It's more like a general experience, if they're even that accurate overall. Although, again, these developers were talking specifically about a look at optimization and trying to make sure low-end hardware could play the game. Now, the main thing that I'm kind of disappointed about here is that they're not telling us at what graphic settings you could be doing this. Now, speculation-wise, I would say minimum is probably the lowest settings with upscaling enabled just to hit that 30 FPS 1080p. Hopefully it's closer to a 40-ish average, and they're just writing 30. That would be nice because I do find 40 a lot more playable than 30 personally. On the recommended spec, again, they're not giving specific graphic settings targets here, but I would expect these to be something close to the console equivalent settings, which on PC Unreal Engine 5 games tends to be somewhere kind of between the medium and high preset, although individual settings can be adjusted very differently. It doesn't always line up to a particular preset, but I'd kind of imagine we were somewhere in that medium to high, and then with upscaling, but again, they don't even say what level of upscaling. It could actually be some games are targeted based off of dynamic resolution scaling, where you go with a 60 FPS target, and then the level of upscaling involved varies based on the gameplay scene and how demanding it is. So it's possible that that's what they're going for here, and that's why they're not listing a specific level of upscaling. Of course, it could also be performance mode upscaling all the time just to hit that. We don't really know. So these aren't the best system requirements, or at least most informative system requirements I've ever seen. Now, where does the 3060 Ti and 6700 XT fall relative to the minimum spec? Well, if we keep the 1660 locked as the minimum spec, now maybe you'll see your GPU along the way. So if you have something like a 1080, you're actually well above the minimum spec, or a 2060, you're well above the minimum spec by 32% there, or a RTX 2070, you're actually 50% over the minimum spec, but we're still not to the recommended spec yet. An RTX 3060 is 66% above the minimum spec. The 5050 is 89% above the minimum spec. The 3060 Ti is 215% of the minimum spec, or in other words, 2.15 times the performance, or a 115% performance increase. So about a little over double the performance of the minimum spec, which kind of makes sense, I guess, based on what we're looking at here, because we're going from 30 FPS to 60 FPS. We're also increasing resolution from 1080p to 1440p, but since some unspecified level of upscaling is involved here, we don't know if this 1440p is with more aggressive upscaling like performance mode, and the 1080p output was with more like quality or balanced. So it's hard to really factor in the resolution into this when there's unspecified levels of internal rendering resolution involved. Again, I'm also speculating that we're getting a graphic settings increase from low to at least medium here, but again, that's just kind of speculation given that it's the recommended spec. Also, the 3060 Ti and 6700 XT are generally a bit more powerful than the GPU inside a PlayStation 5 base console, so that's why I would also suspect you're getting similar graphic settings to what you're seeing in like that PS5 trailer, would be my guess here. Now, the 3060 Ti is just an 8GB card, even though the 6700 XT has more, and they're also generally very close in performance. Now, if you turned on the ray tracing mode, and we know the game will have a ray tracing mode, in this generation of hardware, AMD generally lagged behind, but I imagine the 3060 Ti is probably also not like super great for the ray tracing mode here, although it's not very far off of the RTX 5060, which is only about 11% faster than the 3060 Ti. That shows how little generational improvement we had at the low end for quite a while here, where the 30 series 60 Ti is almost on par with the 50 series 60 non-Ti class, but anyway, that's kind of beyond the point of today's video. But remember that if we now move up into the ray tracing recommended spec, they do list the RTX 5060 there, although note that that's dropping down to 1080p, albeit 60 FPS with upscaling enabled, whereas the 3060 Ti is being listed for 1440p with 60 FPS, also with unknown levels of upscaling enabled. So hard to make too much of a hard claim off of any of that. Now, for the path tracing mode, they're only giving us a recommendation for 4K with upscaling. So 4K 60 with upscaling. I would imagine for 4K path tracing, this is probably performance mode upscaling. Now, the good news is at 4K output resolution, performance mode upscaling with the latest models of DLSS, and this game has been confirmed to support DLSS 4.5, does look pretty good in its performance mode. So, I do imagine this would look pretty decent. Sometimes you get kind of boiling in the path tracing and things like that. Like you can pick apart some of the issues from going into performance mode upscaling here, but it generally looks pretty well put together. And they're recommending an RTX 5080, which is a pretty big jump from what we're seeing on the other recommendations. However, again, note that it's moving up from 1080p or 1440p all the way up to 4K, which is a lot more pixels to drive. And like I said, I would imagine that's probably the performance mode upscaling. Now, I haven't seen any footage of what the full path tracing mode might look like, because again, the 7-month-old RTX inside the game video wasn't specifically calling anything path tracing. So I don't know if they just decided to rename what they were already showing as path tracing, or if they actually did additional features here than what they were doing previously. It's hard to say, but in the previous video here, they weren't talking about ray traced global illumination, which would generally be part of your path, what usually gets called path tracing in games. So I have a feeling things got pushed a little further than what we saw in that initial trailer, but maybe not. Now, overall, what do I think about this? Well, it's nice that they're at least talking about, at least paying lip service to the fact that lower end players, Steam Deck, etc., are worried about Unreal Engine 5 games running well on their systems. And so they're at least acknowledging that that's a focus in their development. And that's a really good sign. That being said, it's hard to tell exactly where we are based on just these system requirements, since they're not telling us what sort of graphic settings they're at. And again, 1080p with upscaling just to hit 30 FPS, like, it's nice that you can get into the game. I'm hoping that 30 is really more like a 40, and I'm also hoping this is one of the games where the lowest settings don't look truly awful, which is often the case these days. Oftentimes low settings actually look kind of completely fine. Like I said, we do have this 11 minutes of gameplay that they said was recorded on a PlayStation 5, and I would speculate that their recommended specs, the 3060 Ti and 6700 XT, are something like what we're seeing here, probably from a graphic settings perspective, since those are roughly, PS5-ish in performance. Generally, they have a bit more of a raw performance advantage over the PS5, but sometimes PS5 settings are dialed in a little bit better, that kind of thing. So overall, that's what we've got. Looks like there's a little bit of stuttering and hitching visible there in the PS5 transition into this scene. Maybe not too bad, but you can see a little stutter right there. So that could be a capture artifact from the video, but this is their own gameplay trailer. So anyway, so being Unreal Engine 5, there's the overall performance level, and then there's also, is it stuttery, that kind of thing. We'll have to see. So that's what I've got for you guys today. I am interested in benchmarking the game when it releases. Let me know if you're interested in seeing that. Like I said, it looks like we're out for a October 28th release date. I hope all of you have an excellent day.